Congratulations, you've come to the end of the course. Let's review what you've learned. We kicked things off with an introduction to Windows Virtual Desktop. You learned what it is and how it works. After you were introduced to Windows Virtual Desktop, you learned how to deploy and configure Azure AD domain services to support a Windows Virtual Desktop deployment. More specifically, you learned how to add a custom domain to Azure AD, how to create test users in Azure AD, and then how to perform the actual Azure AD domain services deployment. Once we deployed Azure AD domain services, you learned how to update DNS on the domain services network, how to create an Azure AD admin account, and then how to force the sync of password hashes for cloud users from Azure AD to Azure Active Directory domain services. You also learned how to deploy and configure a management VM that was used to manage the Azure AD domain services. With most of the prerequisite work complete, you then learned how to set up the virtual network to host the Windows Virtual Desktop deployment. After provisioning the Windows Virtual Desktop virtual network, you learned how to connect the network to the Azure Active Directory domain services network so the Windows Virtual Desktop deployment could communicate with Azure AD domain services. With all infrastructure in place for the Windows Virtual Desktop deployment, you learned how to license test users and how to register the Windows Virtual Desktop provider with an Azure subscription. You then saw how an actual deployment of Windows Virtual Desktop was done. You learned how to create a host pool, how to deploy pool VMs, and how to register a workspace. I then showed you how to assign the desktop application group to your test users before creating and assigning a few remote applications as well. Coming down the home stretch, you learned how to customize the Windows Virtual Desktop workspace. For example, you learned how to change the name of a workspace, how to change the name of the virtual desktops, and how to install and use the Windows Virtual Desktop client for Windows. We rounded out the course with an optional section on FSLogix. In this section, you learned how to install and configure FSLogix to host Windows Virtual Desktop profiles in an Azure file share. You also got to see how to test it and how to ensure profiles are created in the Azure file share. At this point, you should know how to perform a Windows Virtual Desktop deployment in Microsoft Azure using Azure Active Directory domain services. I hope you've enjoyed this course and maybe learned something along the way. Be sure to give this course a rating, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask or connect with me on LinkedIn. As always, thanks for watching and happy learning.